So today I am so thrilled to be able to talk to Emily Oster. I've talked to her several times before over the past couple years on BDA Baby. She brings the calm to all the craziness that's going on in the world, especially as a parent. So I'm really excited to talk to her about her new book, The Unexpected: Navigating Pregnancy During and After Complications. Let's talk to Emily. You know, I'm like a huge fan of all of your books. I've recommended them to all of my friends who are pregnant, who are having babies, having multiple babies, mostly just because I feel like with social media, there's great parts about it, but also all of these shock value headlines that give parents, especially new parents, so much anxiety. And you're like the calm in all of it because you just tackle everything in such a way that's just like, you don't need to worry about this. No, this is crazy. This is not something to focus. Like, I just love the whole intention of just calming people down. So thank you for that. And then this book is doing that exact thing, but in a totally different mindset of like preparation instead of like the after having a baby part of it. And I love this. It's very similar in the sense that I can pick it up and put it down to your previous books, which I love. But I'm curious, why don't we start with where this came from? Because I loved reading your intro about the desire to do this book for so long, but actually the goal to kind of get this out and the need to get this out.
Yeah. So in some ways it's quite different from the other books in terms of motivation, because all of my other books kind of come out of my own experiences and the questions that I had in being pregnant and then being a parent. And this book is really about the questions I got from other people. So Expecting Better came out a decade ago, and over that time I've gotten, thousands and thousands of questions from moms, and some of them are like full of joy, or here's a baby picture, or like, thanks so much because I could add a cup of coffee, and there's a lot of that, which is wonderful. And then there were a lot of questions that were harder. I had preeclampsia, is that going to happen again? Or I had hyperemesis, is that going to happen again? Or what can I do differently the next time so it goes better, or if not, maybe better is the wrong word, but so it's easier. And this book is for the people who ask those questions. So it's the answer to the question, will this happen again? Or at least some sense of what's the chance of this happening again for many of these complications. It's some information about treatment. And then it's a dive into how to talk to your provider about these complications. And I guess what I would say is, like, the book really for me has sort of two core goals. So one is just to be there for the people who need it. So for people who have had one of these complications or are having them, I think that it will be helpful. But it's also to try to get people to recognize how often this is happening and to talk about it more, right? So there's like 50% of pregnancies are complicated by one of these complications we talk about in the book, which means like more than half of pregnant women experience one of this. And I bet when a lot of people look at this table of contents, like, but all of those things are so rare. It's like, no, those things are not rare. And if we treat them as if they're rare, then people feel alone, and they're not alone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I loved about this book was that I also loved about your other books was that it was something that you can pick up and put down based on, in this book, based on the issue. And so it was very digestible and approachable, which I think is so important, especially when you're talking about something that's not necessarily glamorous or joyful all the time. Yes. So I love the way that you did that. But the topics that you talk about in here are also scary, and they, for a lot of people, like me, I've had a lot of friends who have had complicated pregnancies. They've had one or several of the subjects that you talk about in your book, and I read about these different complications because I want to know more about what they were going through or what they were experiencing, especially if they want to have more babies, what the likelihood is of that happening again. But how do you talk about this and lay this out in a way that isn't inducing fear in people?
I think it's a great question. I mean, in part because I think one audience for this book is people who have had something like this happen. And so the answer is like, they're already nervous. They're already afraid. So in contrast to something like Crib Sheet, where a lot of what I say about early parenting is like, well, it's going to be fine. You know, it's fine. Like, don't worry about everything's going to be fine. This is like, well, demonstrably something happened that wasn't fine. And so I still think, despite that, there is so much control that comes from understanding. And for me, that's sort of a core of everything I write, is the idea that if you understand better the medical circumstance or the data behind things, you can navigate them with more confidence in your choices. And when people read this book, if they have had one of these complications, I hope that at the end of this, they will say, oh, I understand much better what happened to me. I understand better why it might happen to me. And I understand how I can navigate if it happens again, which isn't to say that like that's relaxing, but it has a sort of acceptance feature that may help. I do think if you had not had any kids, and if you were coming into a first pregnancy, this book is it is scary. I mean, it's scary, not scary, but it's more. There will be things in there people didn't expect to read about, but again, there's value in information. Although I'm not sure I would hand this to a person when they were pregnant for the first time.
You're like, read up. Good luck. I feel like also with a lot of these complications that you tackle in the book, they are complications that you've heard about in the media now, especially. People are talking about complications in their pregnancies. People are talking about things like miscarriage much more openly. People are talking about hyperemesis gravidarum much more openly. A lot of these topics that you cover in this book, you've heard. You know, it's not like people who have kids on their radar or pregnancy or know someone who is pregnant. Likely you've heard of something that's in this book, and talking about it in a way that is, to me, when I read your book, the thing that I took away from it was a sense of empowerment for people who are pregnant or just wanting to know more about the process of it, because you teach people how short your doctor's appointments are, how you can prepare for that better. And, you know, we talk a lot about this on BDA Baby, but also it seems like it's a big subject in the news. Whatever phase you are in life, being able to feel like you can go into a doctor's office and feel empowered to be an advocate for yourself. And when you're pregnant, it is a whole other kind of world of you're growing a human inside of you. So you're concerned for yourself and the baby and your family and the future of it. So I feel like this book, to me, isn't anxiety causing as much as it felt empowering for people, especially people who have dealt with a lot of these subjects.
Yeah, so the book is co-authored with Nate Fox, who's an MFM in New York. And one of the pieces that we talk the most about between the two of us is how this book can help people bring kind of their expertise together with the expertise of the doctor, right? So how can you make these conversations you have with your doctor as productive as possible, so it doesn't feel like I'm going into this office, I have no idea what happened to me, I don't know anything about, like, not that you don't know anything, but that I don't feel equipped to have a conversation. I have 15 minutes, there's a lot of jargon, I'm supposed to make a decision, I can't make the decision because I don't have enough of a sense of what's going on, and then the appointment is over. And what Nate and I felt was that if you could have the baseline understanding coming into that and a script to say, you know, hey, here's my understanding of the like 4 key things we need to talk about, then that 15 minutes can be used a lot more efficiently. And I think it was fun to write with him because that's kind of how he and I come together. You know, we bring these different pieces of expertise and we try to combine those in the book, and I think it works.
I ask people for questions, which of course, anytime I'm able to talk to you, the questions are just endless. Like it's such a laundry list.
People have a lot of
questions,
very specific
especially
questions, and sometimes it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. Very, not necessarily specific to each person, but just general questions about complications. But before we get to that, I mean, you've been doing this for a while, and you have also created a platform where, as I said in the beginning, you provide calm and reality to a lot of parents, grandparents, people who are focused on the topics that you cover. When you go around and you meet different people or you interact with people on social media, do you find a common theme of the feedback that people give you with what you put out there in social media or in talks or books?
I think a lot of it is people find it relaxing and pretty middle of the road. So one of the things that is a hallmark of a lot of what I talk about is that most of the choices that we make are not, almost no choice you make is kind of the be all or end all that's going to make your kid perfect or ruin them. It's just not the way kids work. And so my sense is that comes across for people. The thing I like the best is when people tell me, I read this headline, but then I thought that you would say it was correlation and not causality. And so then I stopped reading. That's like, that's it. I've like gotten myself out of a job. That's perfect. If like everyone had that reaction, then we wouldn't have so many of those panic headlines. And then I could just enjoy my professor life. Leave Instagram.
Yeah, I know. It's true.
I'm still saying though, there are a lot of panic headlines.
Yeah, there are a lot of panic headlines, but I feel like the way that you tackle them, like I remember when you did the one on Cheerios, it was just like, it's like these headlines that are put out there that just cause panic. And then by the time, you know, the West Coast is awake, everyone on the East Coast has sent it to you because you're a parent. So
it's like ready. It's you just be like throwing the stories. The people DM, they'll be like, what about them? They'll be, I just looked at your stories. Okay, it's fine. My kid only eats Cheerios. I've already made them oatmeal. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
It's okay. Yeah, it also just reminds me, it's very similar to the vibe that my mom has when, you know, that I feel like a lot of parents of my friends have, which is, you know, we did it with none of this overload of information and you guys are fine. Yes. So
no, I think there's definitely a kind of Dr. Spock. I could aspire to some of the tone of Dr. Spock, whose thing was, you know more than you think you do, which was like the 1970s. Yeah. I was like, I think that's about, maybe they were onto something, the parents of the 70s and 80s.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. They're still
onto something. And they want us to know that they're onto it and we are maybe missing it.
Okay, so the different topics, I won't get to every single section of your book because you cover a lot of complications. One of the big ones that a lot of actually my friends asked about and myself I had questions on were epidurals. Since COVID, there's this whole push on social media, it seems, about home births, which everybody should choose how you want to have your baby. Do whatever you want. I had both my girls at the hospital and had a great experience doing it. That being said, both of my epidurals with both of my girls did not work. They both were failed epidurals. I also had friends who had very scary experiences with epidurals that were failed epidurals for C-sections, had to go under general anesthesia, and wondering how much that comes up because you hear about people who go in and have no problems with epidurals. And when I was reading it, I was just like, is this, because I want to have more kids, is this going to happen a third time for me with a failed epidural, or what's that going to be like?
Okay, so there are, so most epidurals are successful. So an epidural is generally pretty successful. The main complications it can happen are two. So one is it cannot work. And unfortunately for you, a lot of times that is just like some people are not responsive to the epidural. So, you know, it might not work again. Now, they can also put it in wrong. So it could be that you got it in wrong twice. But like with many complications, if a thing happens a second time, one has to wonder if that's when you start thinking maybe it's something that in this case might be specific to your physiology.
With me.
Maybe it's yeah. The other thing that can happen with an epidural is what's called a wet tap, where they hit the sort of wrong part of the spine, and that can lead to a very bad headache, although not long-term complications. But, you know, most of the time, like the vast majority of births in the U.S. have epidurals, and most of the time this is an uncomplicated procedure that works out good. For some women, if they don't want to have an epidural, there are increasingly other options. The particular one is nitrous oxide, which is a kind of lighter touch approach to pain relief. It's used a lot in the UK where they call it gas and air. It's basically you like inhale during a contraction, it like takes the edge off and then it immediately dissipates. So it's not the kind of continuous pain relief, but it could be a good option for you.
I'll look into that. Is that the laughing gas? Great. My husband will love that.
I don't think it has quite the same effect when you're in the middle of, because it's not funny. You know, it's not funny like dental work. It's
you would think so, but just wait. And then does your stance on epidurals or someone who had a past experience not go well with an epidural change with induction?
So it's pretty unusual to not have an epidural if you're induced. So the contractions during an induced labor tend to be quite a bit more intense and painful. And so it's unusual to not have an epidural with an induction. Not that you can't do it, but it's less common.
Miscarriage. You cover this in your book a couple different ways. And you also have a chart in your book about miscarriage at a certain timeline, how many miscarriages, in what stage of pregnancy, etc. Someone was asking about unexplained miscarriage. For people who do testing after the miscarriage or there was a specific reason that something had happened, is there such thing as an unexplained miscarriage?
So almost all miscarriages are unexplained. So when people miscarry in the first trimester, which is the vast majority of miscarriages, so the miscarriage rate begins at probably 25%, if we think about just the very, very beginning of pregnancy, and declines pretty rapidly through the first trimester. Almost all, maybe 90% of miscarriages in that phase of pregnancy are a result of chromosomal abnormalities. So in that sense, they may not be unexplained because we understand broadly what has probably gone on, but they are almost never explained in the sense that it is very uncommon to test the tissue, so you don't tend to know what happened. When we move into the second trimester, miscarriages are much less common, but there are also some explanations, and we talk through a lot of this in the book. There are some things which are sort of more common explanations, which we could understand and then sometimes treat. So there are problems with the cervix can cause miscarriage in the second trimester. There are some other conditions that can cause that. It's still true that a large share of miscarriages remain effectively unexplained and probably are a result of some kind of incompatibility with life. So, and then, things happen that we don't know. And even if there is some underlying explanation that we could have, most of the time people will not know what it is. Nate talks some in the book about the idea of radical acceptance, that sometimes with these complications, even the things that are really, really hard, you just have to emotionally figure out how to accept them and move to the next phase, because you're not going to get the answers that maybe we would all want.
Someone had also mentioned something about a pregnancy being at risk for a miscarriage and how to manage that if you've been told by your doctor while pregnant that this is something that could happen while you're sitting pregnant.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that could mean, and for me this is part of the in some ways the problem with how we communicate, that your doctor may well just say, you're at elevated risk for miscarriage, so you should be aware of that. But the reason for that is going to influence what you want to do. So if the reason is that you're older, older women are at elevated risk for miscarriage because there's more chromosomal abnormalities in older eggs. There's nothing you can do about that. If you've had a prior preterm birth because your cervix dilated too fast, you are at increased risk for miscarriage, but there is something we can do. So this is a place where I would say the answer to what does that mean lies in, like, why? And that's the first question I would come to my doctor with is, you said I'm at elevated risk. What are the factors about my case or who I am that are causing you to say that? So we can think about, is there anything we can do about it?
Hyperemesis, gravidarum. This is something that we definitely are talking more about openly. Certain well-known people have talked about their experiences with having it. From what I have heard and seen, it's really horrible. My mom, when she was pregnant with my younger brother, had hyperemesis gravidarum, and it was something that at the time, like, she reflects on it now and she just says nobody knew what it was. And my brother is 26 now. And I remember her vividly because I was 8, and I remember going to stay with her in the hospital. She was in there for so long, she couldn't keep anything down. So I definitely remember it being horrible. How normal is having hyperemesis gravidarum? Because it is something that we hear a lot more about and that is very scary for women experiencing it.
So it's about 2% of pregnancies, I think. So it's like a relatively rare complication. Although, 2% is not 0.2%. It's also, there's a huge continuum of this, right? So a very large share of women experience some nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. This is different than that. And that's a really important distinction to make because nausea and vomiting is so common. I think one of the things I heard so frequently from women who had experienced this when I talked to them was like, people just did not understand that there was a difference between, like, I feel a little nauseous when I wake up in the morning and, like, I literally have to be hospitalized for dehydration because I, like, cannot consume water. And that experience is so vastly different. What's frustrating about hyperemesis is we don't have much in the way of treatment. So the recurrence rate is, something ranging from sort of 15 to maybe 50%. So there's a reasonable chance of recurrence, not 100% chance of recurrence. But we don't really have good treatments, which is frustrating.
And what is I feel like for people who, I know you just mentioned that most people experience some sort of nausea or vomiting in pregnancy. What is the spectrum of that? Like, when would you know that you have some form of hyperemesis and that you aren't just experiencing normal morning sickness?
So there's a technical definition which has to do with, like, dehydration. But if you are not able to consume food at all, there isn't an answer to this in the behavior. Like, how would you know? And in fact, I think it's a mistake to even look for that answer because I think it leads people to be like, well, my dehydration is not that bad. Like, I had a half a glass of water yesterday, so I'm probably fine. And that is why we don't go to the doctor. So I would always tell someone, like, if you are vomiting many times every day, if you are, having trouble keeping food down, tell your doctor. Maybe they will say we diagnose you, maybe they won't, but there are some things that you can try to help with. And people are way too reluctant to talk to their doctor about this.
Is your goal one of the goals with this book is to kind of change that habit of especially women not calling their doctor?
And not telling them about what is going on. I mean, and a good example of this is like postpartum depression, which we talk about in the book. And one of the big differences between postpartum depression with the first kid and with the second is actually people are way more likely to be treated after a second pregnancy. So in some sense, like that chapter of this book is like, I would say, somewhat upbeat, because if you had postpartum depression in a first pregnancy, it's pretty likely you'll have that in a second, but you will already know how to treat it. Like, you will already have had, hopefully, the experience of like, okay, do I need drugs? Do I need, what kinds of therapy? Do I need a sleep structure? Whatever it is. In a first pregnancy, that often doesn't get treated because people don't think it's that bad. They don't tell their doctor. They don't want to surface it. I think there's so much of this that we just need to be willing to say, hey, I'm having a hard time. Or, hey, is this symptom normal? Or, hey, I need help navigating this. People just should be more willing to talk about these problems.
With postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, I feel that a lot of that is met with how much of this is normal. Mm-hmm. What part of this? One of my best friends just had a baby, and she called me and said that she was sitting on her couch and she's crying constantly. She's sweating. She's exhausted. Her boobs are hurting her. And she said, how much of this is normal? Is there an answer that you have for people when they're trying to navigate postpartum depression? And also, I mean, for my experience, for example, with both of my kids being born during the pandemic, I feel like the postpartum anxiety was through the roof. That I'm just like, I don't know, when I have more kids, should I have more kids, what that will be like, because the world is so different than it was when I had my first daughter 4 years ago.
You'll be so relaxed. I don't like the question of whether, I don't like the question, is this normal? And I would encourage people not to ask that question, because I don't know why it would matter. The thing people should think about is, am I doing okay? Am I able to enjoy time with my baby, at least some of the time? Am I like functioning in the world? Is my relationship with my partner okay? All of these things are hard. Like, I'm not saying it's not going to be hard. You know, this isn't the week of your honeymoon, but asking the question, am I feeling okay? Or am I feeling like this is too much? If you are feeling like this is too much, then it's not normal and you should ask for help. It doesn't matter if somebody else does think it's normal, or somebody else is having the same, has a baby of the same age and the same structure and is doing better. It's just irrelevant. I think the question of, are you doing okay? And if you are not, ask for help.
I love that. Also the whole culture of comparing
Totally.
Each other, I think especially it's on social media.
Look, some people are going to go be in a pageant when their baby is 8 days old, and some people are not. And that's okay.
Yeah, it is. VBACs. Again, something that to me is talked a lot about on social media. People talking about their experience, their desire to have vaginal births after cesarean. What's the data on them versus what we see on social media being talked about them?
There's a couple of considerations in the question of sort of whether to have a VBAC and what choice to make there. On the medical side, there's kind of two pieces of it. One is, what's the risk? What's the potential risk for if you try to have a vaginal birth? And there's a small risk, it's about 1%, of uterine rupture. And if that happened, then you need an emergency C-section. And there are some risks. That's the risk side. And then there's the question of like, how likely is it to be successful? And so there are some factors across individuals that make you more or less likely to be able to give birth vaginally that have to do with what happened in your prior labors and other things about the baby. This is, I think, the most classic example in the book of where like a shared decision-making model is between a patient and a doctor is important, because those are some medical facts and there are some numbers that you can get from your doctor and some pieces of expertise that the doctor brings around, are you a good candidate for this? Can our hospital actually support this? What's the chance of success? What are the possible risks? But then individual people are going to have very different preferences. So some people have a cesarean. They say, I really want to have a VBAC. This is really important to me. It's really a goal that I have. And then some people, I thought my cesarean was great and I'd be delighted to have a second one. And those two people should definitely not, or should not necessarily choose the same thing. And that's a preference thing. So when Nate and I talk about this, and when he talks about how he talks to his patients about these, I always start with what's important to you? What is the experience you want? And then can we think about, is that a realistic option for you?
We touched on induction when we were talking about epidurals. Again, with everything going on social media, there's so many videos about feelings, better word to have it, about what your choices are when you're delivering, where you're delivering, what the lights are when you're delivering, a lot of things. With induction, thoughts on induction for people who are contemplating that route?
So we have relatively recent, quite good data that when done well, and mainly that means patients, induction does not seem to lead to an increased risk of C-section. So that's caused a lot of people to push more in the direction of induced labor, and a lot of doctors to be more open or even encouraging of people having inductions. Again, I think it depends quite a lot on the experience that you are interested in having as the birthing woman. So, if you want to start labor at home and labor at home for a while and then not have an epidural and give birth in a tub at a birthing center, you're not going to do that that's not compatible with an induction. Some people have that kind of thing is more important than others. And so to sort of say blanket wise, we know inductions are safe and effective, which they are, that doesn't mean that they're the right thing for everybody. It depends. It depends what you want. I don't know. If you want to give birth at home, you're not going to have an induction.
It's not allowed.
They don't have that at home.
Lastly, one of the questions that people asked was about fetal growth restriction, which I had never heard about, known about, until one of my very close friends experienced that with her first pregnancy, was nervous her second pregnancy about it happening again. Thank God it did not. But is there anything anybody can do when experiencing fetal growth restriction in one pregnancy?
So not really. Fetal growth restriction is a little bit of a complicated term because it technically refers to the fetus growing slower than it should. It is sometimes diagnosed just if your baby is small, which is not the same as growing slowly. So the baby could be small and growing at a good rate. They could also be growing slowly. And if the baby is growing very slowly, that might indicate a problem with the placenta. The only thing that's really closely linked to fetal growth is how much you're eating. So certainly if someone were, malnourished or smoking, quitting smoking and making sure that they are eating an adequate number of calories is a way to make sure the baby is larger. But if the fetal growth restriction is occurring, even in the context of those things, there isn't a lot of treatment beyond sometimes early delivery if there's really a concern about slow growth.
If you're someone who's experienced pregnancies that have gone vaginal birth smoothly and, you're wanting to continue to have kids, does the data show that your pregnancies after would likely line up with your previous experiences?
A general rule is that the past is informative about the future. And so, one of the things we talk a lot about in the book is that's true for almost every complication, that having had it increases the risk of having it later, and as a result, having not have it decreases the risk of having it later. That varies quite a lot across condition, how high the recurrence risk is. But if you have had, 2 uncomplicated pregnancies, the chance of having another uncomplicated pregnancy is certainly higher than if you had complications in an earlier pregnancy. And one thing that's very, very correlated over time is vaginal birth. So if you've had 1 vaginal birth, or especially if you've had 2 vaginal births, the chance that you'll have a vaginal birth on a 3rd kid is much higher, just because it's, you've shown that you can do it before, and also things have kind of loosened a bit.
Your body's gone.
It knows what to do. It knows familiar. It's ready. It's ready.
Okay. Well, I mean, before we wrap up, one of the biggest and most important parts of this book, as I mentioned, was a feeling of empowerment, but also the empowerment with information that you provide. And also, we've talked so much, and it seems like this is such a big conversation that goes around about finding a doctor that's right for you. Pregnancy is a very emotional time for people. It's very stressful for a lot of people. And finding a doctor that they feel comfortable with is such a huge gift. You hear these stories of people who don't feel like they're heard with their doctor. They choose one thing, the doctor does another thing. Is there any advice that you would have? Because this book, tackles so many different topics that are, for a lot of people really challenging to talk about, to wrap their head around, experiencing again or ever. And being able to have those conversations with someone who actually listens to you and pays attention to what you're saying is a gift. Is there anything that you would say to give someone advice who feels like maybe they would not be in a situation or don't find themselves with a doctor who's really hearing them out?
So one thing is, if your doctor isn't listening to you, you could consider switching doctors, which is a little bit of a facile thing to say, but I think people often assume that that's like literally impossible, and it's not. So sometimes the answer is the situation is so extreme that you need to find somebody else. In the event that you are not, I think the only advice I would give, really based on this book, is to try as much as possible to structure what you're trying to get out of the conversation. So you're going to get more information, maybe better decision making, if you can come in with a concrete set of ideas and asks. But it's hard. I mean, it's hard when your provider doesn't listen. That's a really tough situation. I have 2 kids, and with the first kid, I really did not feel very listened to, and I wrote a whole book, and I think you can sort of feel that some in Expecting Better, that like this experience was frustrating, and I didn't get the answers I wanted. I felt like I spent a lot of time on my own, and when I came with questions, I was often dismissed as a crazy person, which I am, but still some of my questions were valid. Right. When I got to the second kid, I had a different provider and someone who really listened to me. Actually, I had a midwife on the second kid. They listened all the time. They were really helpful. I would often say, like, I don't think I would have written Expecting Better if I had had that experience the first time, because it was sort of exactly what I needed. So provider's important.
Definitely is. It's a gift to have a great one. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for taking the time. I'm so excited.
Thank you so much.
For this book
thank you for having me. I'm so excited about having the book out in the world.
I'm so excited for you, and excited for everybody to be able to get their hands on it and get the book and see where you're going on tour, because that's such an exciting part of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Emily, so much for talking today. I had such a great conversation, learned so much about so many different complications that you guys asked about, my friends asked about, I personally wanted to know more about. So I feel very filled with information. You can get Emily's book, The Unexpected: Navigating Pregnancy During and After Complications, out now. She's also on a book tour, so if she's going to be coming to your area, make sure you check out where she's going on her social channels. And thank you again, Emily, for always coming and providing the calm that we need.